Hey, deserving listeners, it's just me again today. I thought I would answer some patron emails, and a reminder that I'm still sick, so I might sound a little hoarse with my voice. And also a reminder that I'm recording this in late July, so if around this episode, the time that it's published, you see me on Instagram hanging out with other people, I am all likely out of the contagious zone. My doctor even said that he thinks I'm out of the contagious zone now, but I am just trying to play it safe. I don't have COVID, or at least I've tested negative for COVID, so it's unlikely I have COVID. I think I just have like a regular cold that I remember getting before. I said in an earlier episode that I haven't been sick in, I think, 4+ years. And it's a very weird experience, after the pandemic. I'm sure all y'all have been sick at least once, maybe with COVID. So you already broke that seal. But for me, it was all this worry of viruses and whatnot. And then to finally be sick, it's like, oh yeah, I remember this feeling. All right, this next email is from upper tier patron Maria. She says, I thought you might find this short podcast series interesting. Selfishly, I would love to know your thoughts on it. It's called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. Thank you for everything that you do, Dr. Kirk. I feel like your content helps me to be a better daughter, sister, partner, friend, and physician. End of email. Well, that's high praise, Maria. Thank you for that. Yeah, I did listen to the podcast, The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling. And what do I say? Well, what I'll say is that when I was listening to the podcast, it seemed biased towards J.K. Rowling. It didn't seem to present the full breadth of everything that she has said that was transphobic on the internet. So if you just listen to the podcast and you don't look into it yourself, you might find yourself swayed for J.K. Rowling and against those who are criticizing her. That's my opinion. The other thing that the podcast, I think, does, and I think it does it well, is that it points out that in our current society, and maybe we've always been like this, that we tend to have mob mentality when it comes to attacking people. And in today's milieu, it's attacking people online, right? And I appreciated that after myself being a very minor victim of that during the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial last year. I can attest to just how horrible it is. And I can't imagine what it'd be like to be someone like Rowling. It's one thing to criticize her and to maybe even ban her books or something. It's another thing for J.K. Rowling to feel in fear for her life on a constant basis. So there's something going on in our culture that needs to change. And it points out that, I think, pretty effectively. What also the podcast does is it lays out the inherent sexism and misogyny in our society that has been around for, centuries. But even in history, there were times when our society would be going through something difficult, and for whatever reason, women would be the lightning rod for everyone's hatred, and men somehow are completely off the hook. Because, we understand that there's a lot of transphobia in our society committed by people of all genders, right? But for whatever reason, women are often the most attacked people, right? So, and not only women, but feminist women, because she is a feminist who has been fighting for women. And that's another interesting part of the podcast as it goes into her history, which I didn't know anything about. Another interesting part of the podcast is that J.K. Rowling is a very well-spoken person, very well-read person. She, the way that I thought of her before listening to the podcast was that she was just this old person who was out of touch and tweeting all this nonsense. But when you actually hear her, the nonsense that she posts online is actually coming from a very educated place. And that was another thing I thought, well, given how smart she is, and given that in a lot of ways she's on the right side of history, why is she doing this? And I thought, well, maybe she doesn't understand how the internet works or something. And then I also thought there could be a part of her that's traumatized, and when people push back on her, particularly maybe in an aggressive way, given her traumas of being aggressed upon, that she just kind of shuts down and says, no, you're not going to win. I will win. So I was wondering if something like that was going on, because the podcast really reveals a very smart but traumatized individual, J.K. Rowling, like really, really smart. I was just off the cuff. J.K. Rowling could speak of history and sexism and trauma and emotion and society. And I don't know. I was just, at the same time I'm impressed with her, I'm just like, well, then why are you saying these horrible things online? Like, all you got to do is just say it differently. There's so many other ways you could be saying these things, So yeah, that was my reaction to that. Oh, and the other thing that the podcast really illuminated me to was the fans of Harry Potter. For me, Harry Potter came out when I was an adult. I remember seeing the first Harry Potter book in the 90s and early aughts. I was doing therapy in people's homes, and one of the things that not all the work I was doing was in homes, but a good portion. And there were years of my early career where I was doing that 99% of the time, and I would enter the home, and I'd be the family therapist. And if I wanted to talk individually with anyone, it would be easier if we went into a room instead of just being in the living room, because if we're in the living room, other people can hear and they're sort of walking in and out. So if I was talking to a kid, I would go into their room and talk with them. It was also a great opportunity to get to know the kid by seeing their room. You get to learn a lot about people when you see the things that they have in their room. Anyway, and I started seeing this Harry Potter book everywhere. And I remember thinking, what is this? This was way before the movies and everything, right? And, some of the kids would be talking about the books and stuff. Anyway, so for me, when, and then as the books started to come out, they became more and more popular. And my mom actually had the books on tape, audio cassette. I have a mild form of dyslexia, which makes it hard for me to read. So I usually only read if I'm doing it for academia, because that's about as much as my brain can handle. So I don't typically read fiction, because it's frustrating, and it actually kind of is hurtful. It hurts my brain sometimes. So when audiobooks came out, I was elated because I could finally, quote unquote, read these books that I always wanted to read. I listened to the first Game of Thrones books, way back 22 years ago or something. I listened to the first Game of Thrones book, and with Harry Potter. So my mom also listens to books, and it was on audio cassette back then. She had the first 4 books on audio cassette, and I borrowed them from her and listened to them and really loved the first book. The second book, not so much. The third book I liked. Fourth was okay. But the first, I just wish, to me, nothing comes close to that first book, really. It's just a magical, excuse the pun, book and story. And everything is perfect. The setting, I remember when I was listening to the book, I thought this would be an excellent movie. It was almost like Rowling was writing a screenplay as a novel, right? Or writing a novel as a screenplay, because I could see the movie in my head the way she was writing, I could hear the soundtrack and everything. And when the movie came out, everything was perfect except for Harry Potter himself. I had a very different vision of what Harry Potter looked like, but everyone else was just spot on. Anyway, so when the controversy around J.K. Rowling was going on in earnest a few years ago-ish, it didn't really shatter me because I'm not a huge Harry Potter fan. In fact, I have kind of a love-hate relationship with it. Well, slightly hate, because the books are formulaic in that it's like a Scooby-Doo episode in which a common thing that Scooby-Doo episodes would do was there'd be all these mysteries, that Scooby-Doo and Shaggy and everyone would be like, oh, what's going on? And then in the last minute of the show, suddenly everything would be revealed. So it's not really a mystery. It's more like, oh my God, what's happening? It was sort of like a Lost episode with a very unsatisfying, real quick ending. Also, I wasn't young, so when I listened to them, I was in my 30s, and it just didn't resonate with me. However, I learned from, life, but also from this podcast, that for younger people who would have been about Harry Potter's age, and really people of all ages, but particularly if you grew up in an abusive household and you always had a fantasy of being able to rise above it or something, and you felt like a misfit, and you could just imagine that this book, this series, this culture would be a godsend, And so for a lot of people who felt like they were on the outside of society, often a lot of LGBTQ people, right? A lot of trans kids, a lot of gay kids, really took to the Harry Potter world because you could say the story kind of codes as the triumph of the non-mainstream kids, And so, attacking kids for being muggles and attacking kids for being poor and attacking kids, and then those kids end up, with Ron and Hermione and Harry, they rise above it all. And it's a glorious, story along those in that way, especially when you string out the books over time and the fandom and the movies. Anyway, so when Rowling comes out and is apparently transphobic, then it's devastating, right? It because not only were the books important, but Rowling herself was important. It wasn't just the books; it was also her herself, and for her to dig her heels in with some of her transphobic messages, it was very hurtful and very traumatic for these people and very upsetting. It's one thing when you just hear a Republican politician saying these things. You expect that. But it's another thing when someone that you opened yourself up to, that you allowed into your soul, such as J.K. Rowling, and then that person turns on you in the ways that you expect people to turn on you from far away, your anger can be much greater towards that person than it would be towards a more distant person. So I think that was another part of the story, was that the vitriol and the anger against J.K. Rowling had to do with that, So, and I'm sure it's way more complicated the way I'm saying, because I don't really follow these things. But yeah, so The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, I think a well done podcast, pretty easy, pretty quick. But if you listen to that and only that, then I'm guessing you're going to walk away with a biased point of view towards J.K. Rowling. All right, this next email is from middle tier patron Jess from Denver. She says, I have an ongoing issue ending things with someone who moved to my state hoping to be with me. We dated in his state and lived together off and on during the start of the pandemic, but then I moved out to Colorado, and at first I was down with him moving here, but I quickly realized that we weren't compatible and he's not the one. Okay, so just trying to get everything straight here. Jess, you were dating someone off and on, or you were dating someone and you were off and on living together. And then you were moving to Colorado, and either you wanted him to come or he offered to come with you to Colorado. He did. So now you're both living in Colorado, in Denver, I'm guessing. And because that's what you said, you're just from Denver. And then you quickly realized that you weren't compatible and that you didn't want to, not only you didn't want to live with him, but you didn't want to be in a relationship with him. Okay. Before he moved out here, I wrote him an email letting him know I can only offer friendship and that he should only move here for himself, not me. Oh, so before he moved out to Colorado, I wrote him an email letting him know I can only offer friendship. So it sounds like you broke up as a couple, you moved to Colorado, he wanted to be with you. He says, hey, I want to come out. And you're like, hey, yeah, if you want to move out, that's fine, but we're only going to be friends. We're not going to be romantic going on. He still moved out here, and since then has been persistent about being together. I have gone along with it because I feel bad he sold his house in another state and moved here. I hate to feel I'm letting him down and hurting him, even though I know a clean break is kinder to him as well. I barely tell him I love him back, but he keeps telling me he loves me and he doesn't know what he would do without me, and I feel so pressured. I've given him many overt signals that I'm not interested in more than a friendship, but he is very pushy. I can't end it. I feel responsible that he moved here for me. And what if he doesn't listen and keeps persisting? Is an email okay to end things? He is very adamant and persistent, and it's hard for me to do it in person. I just want to be free of this relationship, and it's eating away at me that I haven't completely ended it. End of email. Yeah, I've run into this a lot in my office and also in my personal life. Yeah, you're very self-aware, so that's good. You understand the situation. Your language is kind of interesting. I just want to take a second to drill down on some of the things that you said. You say that he moved out here and he's persistent about being together. And then you say, I have gone along with, meaning that you have agreed to be with him romantically because I feel bad he sold his house. And then you say, I barely tell him I love him back. So it's good that you can admit that you have gone along with the relationship, that you have told him that you love him back. And so, it's good that you can admit that because it's not like he's just forcing a relationship on you. Now, if we were there observing this relationship, it's possible that you are being coerced. It's possible that he is giving signals that something dangerous could happen if you don't agree with it. And if that's the case, then you're in an abusive relationship and you need to get support to get out of it. But I'm not hearing anything overt about that. To me, if you were my friend, obviously the easiest advice I could give is to break up and end it. But if you haven't done it by now, since you already have all this self-awareness, then I would recommend therapy because the issue is deeper than even this guy. The fact that you would stay in a relationship that you don't want to be in, and I get it, you feel bad. You might have given him mixed signals. He moved out. It doesn't sound like you gave him mixed signals, but at least you care about him and you don't want to hurt his feelings. But you still know that it's worse for him if you don't break up with him because it's bad for him to be in a relationship with someone who doesn't want to be with you. But so yeah, I would go to therapy to work on your people-pleasing impulses and your perhaps lack of connection with your own needs, with perhaps your lack of assertiveness, your lack of acknowledging what's really happening. You might have had a lot of denial growing up in your family of origin, because I'm guessing that this email represents a moment of clarity for you, and that when you're in the moment with him, you just kind of push it aside. Because I'll tell you, since I'm not a people pleaser myself, not really. I mean, I certainly have tendencies, but I'm not really in that direction. If I was in your shoes, I wouldn't be able to handle it second by second. I would be so upset and bothered and annoyed that I wouldn't be able to help myself but to say, I'm breaking up with you and I can't ever see you again and stop pestering me. You know what I mean? For you, it sounds like internally you might occasionally have these feelings. So getting in touch with those feelings, because you deserve to be in touch with those feelings, but also a great portion of one's ability to build a life that is good for you is to be in touch with those feelings and to have them be spontaneously accessed so that in the moment it will motivate behavior. Because if I were you, Jess, I would be fucking pissed, not necessarily at him, but at the scenario. Like, this guy's wasting your time and invading your space. Maybe it's partly your fault, but still, it's annoying to be forced into a relationship, to have to hang out with someone romantically and act like you want to be with them, or at least appease them when you don't want to be with them. I mean, I'm guessing deep down there's a lot of anger in you. And the fact that you don't have access to that and it doesn't motivate you to do something about it. And I'm not saying you're supposed to smack him across the face. I'm saying, that anger of just like, no, I'm not going to live another day with this stupid situation. I don't want this, the fact that you don't have access to that, or it doesn't well up within you the way it would for me, means that there's probably a whole number of circumstances in your life, past, present, future, in which will harm you because you're not in touch with those feelings. So I think therapy would help. All right, let's take a break. All right, this next email is from anonymous middle tier patron. She wrote in and asked me to comment on a news story that's going around regarding a student at Antioch University where I teach who is complaining about how woke the university is. And I mean, that's my summary of it. I don't know if that's how this individual would describe it. So for various legal and ethical reasons, I can't speak about this case in particular, of course. But what I will say in general is that there have been, a handful of situations like this over the past 3 decades of my involvement with Antioch. And what I'll say is that, and I've never been the target. Well, I have been kind of the target of one of them, but not really. My point is that I'm usually an outsider looking in, and I'm curious about it. I'll hear about a news story that will be circulating about one or more students who was saying they were mistreated by the university, maybe even by my program, and they might be suing the program or complaining about this and that. And what I'll say is that the dynamics are difficult because the student technically can say whatever they want unless they're lying, right? But if they are complaining about their experiences in class, they can speak publicly about those complaints, of course, because they have rights and freedom of speech. But as a university, we don't necessarily have, and as professors, we don't necessarily have that freedom to publicly defend ourselves for a variety of ethical and legal reasons. So often what ends up happening is when you have a conflict between a student and a program, or a student and a professor, and the student decides to go public, there's no counter story. There's no other side to the story that's being offered because of various different ethical, legal, and really marketing reasons, because universities typically, in my experience, don't want to get into that sort of public fighting back and forth with a student. So often what will happen is that if you are someone from the outside of the university and you're hearing this complaint and you don't hear any counter to the complaint, then it can be very convincing, right? It's like, well, you have one story and you don't have any counter story, so it's more likely that you're going to believe that story. At least you're not given an opportunity to hear from the other side. Because often what the universities are building up for is either legal action, which doesn't necessarily involve public statements, and also trying to protect themselves from a potential lawsuit in the future. There's just a lot of reasons as why a student can complain about a university and be very convincing because the university is sort of hamstrung. Their hands are tied behind their back. So is this a situation like that? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not involved in any of this drama, so I can't really tell. On a completely unrelated note, what I will talk about now is the politics or the viewpoints of various different universities over time. And one of the things I'll just speak from my own personal experience. So when I entered my master's program in the mid-90s, I was one of the only cis straight men, particularly in my program. And in a number of courses, of course, in a counseling program, you're going to talk about sexism and bias. And there were discussions about those topics. And most of it was very enriching and very safe for me to participate in. But there would be times when I would feel hurt by some of the things that were being said. And when I was 25, 24 years old, I didn't know what I know now. So I imagine some of that hurt as a student was actually not necessarily justified. When you come from a privileged group and you hear the underprivileged, the victims of your privilege, speaking out against it, it can feel threatening because sometimes the language is absolute. Like, well, men, all they do is want to put women down, right? And as a man, being myself, I would say, well, I don't want to put women down. And it's, the discourse around this can be confusing. Can one say, well, men, they're trying to keep women down, while also believing that a lot of men don't consciously want to keep women down, and maybe a lot of men are actually fighting to level the playing field, so to speak. Yeah, but sometimes the discourse requires, kind of stark, absolute statements, or it's appropriate to say some things, depending. It really just depends. But anyway, so as a man, I would be hurt sometimes by some of the things that were said about my kind, and it would upset me. But what do I do with that upset? Now, some of my upset was probably justified. I would agree with it today. Might someone back then had said something really unfair about men? Like, well, all men, all they want to do is sexually assault women all the time. That is completely empirically not true. And I'm offended when people believe, I've heard people say such things, and that's absurd and dehumanizing to me and awful and pigeonholing and just terrible and wrong. So might someone have said something like that back then? Yeah, I'm guessing someone did. So some of my hurt back then might have been, as a student, might have been justified. Some of it might have been just a reaction of like realizing and facing my privilege, So that is something that a lot of privileged individuals will experience when they enter into a university or into a situation where you're going to hear people talking about topics like this. And the way that I dealt with it was I just buried it. When I was hurt, I didn't speak up in class. I was too shy. I also knew I didn't know anything. And so I just thought, well, that doesn't sound right to me, but I don't know. I know I don't know a lot of things. There was some benefit to me being 24 and really not of that world, of the psychology, social justice world, that kept me very humble. At least I hope so anyway. And so I just didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. And other people, though, might react differently, right? They might say, no, you can't say those things about my people. Another venue where this would get talked about is around white people. And people in discussions about racism will say, well, white people or things along those lines. People are upset, they're hurt, they're angry about past racist acts that they've been victimized by white people, and they will talk about it in a hurt, angry way, which is natural. And so if you are a privileged white person, you are faced with that hurt of like, oh, they're talking about me. They're talking about my family. They're talking about my people. How do I feel about that? Are they correct? Are they going too far? What's happening right now? What do I do? Some people will be quiet like me. Some people will process it in a healthy way, like just raising their hand and saying, I'm having some feelings of hurt and I don't know how to process that. I don't know if it's just because I'm not used to hearing these things and I need to be kind of hurt in this way, or maybe I'm hurt because for legitimate reasons. I don't know. Can we talk about that? That'd be a legitimate, healthy way to raise your hand. I was too shy, and probably still am, to say such a thing. But other people might get angry. They might say, no, you can't do that. You are giving in to the woke culture. You are too liberal, and this is a problem because the program is too political, this kind of thing. Will some people react that way? Yeah, I would say it's very rare that people will react that last way, but they can. And when you do that, you might kind of dig in, right? And then you might come to find yourself in conflict with the whole entire program. Now, the other thing I'll say, as a professor at Antioch for many, many years, what I will say is that sometimes conflicts between students and professors, everyone's playing a role. And if you just hear the complaints, you might really, I'll just say it's similar to couple therapy. A couple will come into my office and each will tell their side of the story. And as I'm listening to each side of the story, I am sympathizing with each side. Let's say it's a heterosexual couple. The wife is telling me, oh, he's so irresponsible and and I'm like, oh boy, that sounds rough. Like, wife, you sound like you're the reasonable one. Your husband is the jerk face. And then I listen to the husband and he's like, well, she's always criticizing me and yelling at me, and her expectations are always too high. And I'm like, oh, husband, you sound really reasonable, and she sounds really stern and unfair. So what's the real story then? Who's right, who's wrong? Well, often it's because little conflicts were not dealt with well in the beginning, and then that blossomed into a bigger problem. And so with students and professors, or students and programs, often that's the case as well. I can't know individual situations, but often that is the case. For instance, as an example that will illustrate this, I'll give an example from my own life as a professor that I was dealing with directly. I'll change details, or I won't give very many details to mask the identities, but a student that I was working with a lot many years ago, she was found to have been committing some fairly egregious ethical violations as an intern. And when I tried to help her with it, I said, hey, you can't do this again. So I'm going to give you a second chance. So don't ever do this again. And then she did it again. And then I said, okay, this is really the last chance. You can't ever do this again. So don't ever do this again. And then she did it again. And then I went back to her again. I said, if you do it one more time, I will have to take major action against you, maybe even kicking you out of the program. So don't ever do this again. And then she did it again. And then I kicked her out of the program, and then she sued the university and me, and she did not win because I had documented everything and it was all very cut and dry. And it was a sad moment for me. I never want to do that sort of thing, but they were egregious ethical violations. I had given her multiple chances. I had been very direct with her. I thought I was very fair with her. And the fact that she kept committing the same exact ethical violation every time, it wasn't even like a different ethical violation. There were other ethical violations. That was the other thing is, as with the ethics cases that I will review, usually the problem is just the tip of the iceberg, the identified problem. Sort of like with Al Capone, he was imprisoned because of tax evasion, but that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of all the criminal acts that Al Capone had committed. So it's similar with clinicians when they commit an ethical violation that requires major action. It usually is not an anomaly that they have this one problem anyway. So the problem, though, if I could rewind the clock, was it began as a seed was planted years prior to this with her, that I think if I were to summarize it, she was anxious and she didn't feel secure. And I think the way that she dealt with it was to try to cut corners, or she might have, it's hard to talk about this without going into specifics, but just to be as short as possible, I think if I could go in a time machine and go back to her at the beginning of the program and coach her along the way, I think she would have been better set up such that she wouldn't feel the need to commit the ethical violation. It's like, why did she keep doing these kinds of things? Well, I think it was a problem that was building up over time that no one was aware of, and she wasn't making anyone aware of it. And I think it was anxiety related for her. So when we have these kinds of situations between students and professors, oftentimes what I find is that when I come on the scene, I was program director for a while, and so I would get notified about these conflicts between students and professors. And so I'd be called in to fix the problem by both parties. And the kinds of complaints I would hear from both sides would be pretty severe. But from my experience as a professor, I surmised that if the two parties, the student and or the professor, had addressed the tension earlier on, then it wouldn't have blossomed into what it became. When it comes to couple therapy and marriage therapy, divorce, is a pretty rough situation. Sometimes there can be very angry divorces where it's like, I hate you. I never want to see you. I can't believe I ever married you before. There's a lot of resentment and hatred towards the other person. Well, how did you get there? There's these little steps along the way. And if you can trace yourself all the way back to the beginning of that, in a marriage, maybe divorce was inevitable, but it didn't have to blossom into this mega hatred of each other, Well, sometimes when you have students in programs, that can happen as well. All right, this next email is from good old patron Natasha from California. She says, "Hey Kirk, hope you're enjoying the Seattle summer. I'm re-listening to the narcissistic personality disorder deep dive and was wondering what specifically you disliked about it." So just chiming in, I said in a recent podcast that I listened to the rerun of the narcissistic personality disorder podcast chapters, and I don't know what I said exactly, but I was kind of cringing at the beginning of the series, so I was wanting to maybe redo it. Going on with the email, I realize it's a very long deep dive, so there's probably a lot you could say, but are there core themes you feel you missed? Thanks for reading. End of email. Yeah, no, I don't think I missed core themes. Well, my understanding has furthered since I made that series. So, there's little nuances that I would like to add to. But from my memory, when I was listening to the rerun, I remember just thinking, I could tell, so little peek behind the curtain, when I am making a deep dive in particular, I am staring at my computer screen pretty much the entire time. I'm looking at an outline. And then I will go on tangents, but I always come back to the outline. Well, the outline is written often in a very long way. It's not just like keywords like a PowerPoint. It's like long sentences that I've written out in my outline. And so one of the things that can happen to me if I'm not on the ball is that as I'm reading the outline subconsciously or in my mind, I'm also I'm reading the outline with half of my brain and speaking with the other half of my brain. And I think when I do that, I end up rambling and also repeating myself a lot, because another aspect of this outline process for me is I'll make the outline and the topic will be kind of in my head. And then I look at the outline as I'm talking, and then I'll get like to the first 3 bullet points out of 10. And then I'll think, ooh, I should talk about that. Ooh, I should talk about that. And I'm sort of going off outline, I'm going away from the outline. And then when I come back to the outline, I didn't realize that I addressed those tangents in the outline itself. So then I end up repeating certain points. So anyway, point is that the beginning of Narcissistic Personality Deep Dive, I just didn't like the beginning. The first hour or something, I just felt like I was just off. And I just want to redo that pretty much. All right, let's take a break. Okay, we're back from the break. Middle tier patron Mark from Brooklyn. He wrote in and said, about 3 years ago, in the midst of the COVID lockdowns and social distancing, I discovered your podcast. Your attachment deep dive was one of the few things I have ever read or listened to that I can honestly say was life-changing. So I just want to begin this email by saying truly thank you for hosting this podcast and making psychology accessible for regular people. As it would turn out, your podcast has had such an impact on me that it inspired me to make a career change and become a therapist. I was 32 when I applied to go back to school to study psychology as an undergraduate, and now I'm 35. I am staying for 1 more year to complete my bachelor's before moving on to grad school. Well, just chiming in here, Mark, that is fantastic news. I think we might have communicated at some point, but either way, yeah, that is so honored that you would do that, and that, I could have been a part of that journey. That's a huge honor. So thank you for that email. Going on with your email here. Okay, now I have an actual question for you. I'll be applying for graduate programs in the fall. My GPA is 3.9. I have been volunteering as a research assistant. I was a teaching assistant this past semester, and I will be attending a clinical internship in the fall at a well-known hospital here in New York City. So I feel confident about my ability to get into the right graduate program. Just chiming in here. Well, it depends, Mark, what sort of graduate program you want to go into. I mean, certainly your experience will help with any program you apply to, but like my program at Antioch, we don't necessarily emphasize those kinds of experience things. Like as a research assistant, we're a clinical program. So although research assistants do learn certain skills, but they're not really necessarily translatable to being a therapist. You probably know how to read research better and how to understand it and integrate it better, which will help you clinically, but it won't necessarily help you with listening skills and social justice and that kind of stuff. Anyway, going on. At the beginning of this past, I say that, but I don't know what sort of programs you're going to apply to. If you're going to apply to like a regular master's program, that's one thing. If you're going to apply to be a psychologist and a doctorate program, is another thing. If you're going to apply to become a research psychologist, that's a whole other thing. At the beginning of the past spring semester, I felt dead set on trying to get into a PhD program for clinical psych because of my academic performance. But after talking to several professors, they mostly talked me out of it. As you mentioned on the podcast yourself, if your goal is to be a therapist, then there are not many reasons to pursue a doctorate. Yeah, that's true. They have also helped me to realize that even with my credentials, I am unlikely to be admitted into a PhD program without additional schooling and published research. Well, again, it depends on the sort of PhD program. Like at the University of Washington here in Seattle, if you try to apply to the PhD program in psychology, and that's a non-clinical research-based program, then yeah, at the sort of higher end psychology doctorate programs, and again, these are non-clinical. Basically, you're learning how to do research on rats and humans, and you're in that cycle of publish or perish and funding and all that kind of stuff. And it's a cool, exciting world in some ways, but not for me. So there's that. But if you're applying to get into clinical PhD programs, like a PsyD program is usually a psychology doctorate program, then your background, it won't hurt you by any means, but also won't necessarily help you. Because again, the PsyD programs don't necessarily care if you have research experience. I mean, maybe some do. And certainly we don't look at GPA very much. I can only speak from experience in my program. We look at GPA, but I would have people that would have like a 2.5 in their bachelor degree, but they got their bachelor's like 25 years ago and it was in a different topic. So it kind of varies. But yeah, my guess is that I don't know if you're looking for a non-clinical research-based PhD program. I'm guessing there are clinical PhD programs that are highly sought after. I'm also guessing that in the Northeast, in New England, in New York City, there are elitist PhD programs. On the West Coast, we're more relaxed about those kinds of things. We don't have those kinds of institutions and those kind of traditions and that kind of elitism, I think, that might be present out there. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for. But anyway, they helped me to realize that even with my credentials, I am unlikely to be admitted into a PhD program. This realization has been somewhat demoralizing because I have been absolutely busting my ass for these past 2 years, but I understand why they are right. Well, again, Mark, it depends on what you're busting your ass for. Maybe the rest of your email will explain. In light of that, I have been looking at some top mental health counseling programs in my area. So yeah, if you're looking at a mental health counseling master's program, you don't have to bust your ass to get into those programs. It's a very different world. Typically, masters of mental health or masters of social work or masters of marriage and family therapy, masters of counseling, these programs are pretty easy to get into. And it largely depends on your interview and your essay and has much less to do with your GPA and the kinds of resume that you have. Because most people can't have a resume that really applies to the program. When I was looking at applicants in my program, the applicants, maybe 1 out of 20 would have some sort of experience. Like if I had an applicant who was a nanny, for example, and had worked a lot with children, I actually considered that to be a pretty good indicator that they knew what they were getting into and that they had some skills in working with kids and families. But, it's a far cry from being a therapist, but at least it was something in that direction, So, someone can get a 4.0 in their bachelor's degree in psychology. And for me, as a professor, when I would see that on the application, I'd be like, well, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good student in a master's program as a clinician. It's a very different world. And honestly, sometimes I would see people that had really good grades and I would admit them and they weren't a good fit because they were more academically minded instead of human minded. Being a counselor, being a therapist, it's much more loose and about humans and unmeasurable things like your bond and how good you make someone feel, that sort of thing. But anyway, so you say, in light of that, I've been looking at some top mental health. The other thing is I wouldn't worry about top mental health counseling programs. I mean, I would avoid going to a shitty program, but anyone who says, oh, that's the top mental health counseling program, I would just be skeptical of those kinds of claims. And I've also said this before, that 99% of what you will learn as a clinician will not happen in graduate school. Graduate school, you'll learn a lot. It'll give you some, foundations, but it's just one step among thousands of steps regarding your development as a human being and as a clinician. So it doesn't, you could go to the shittiest mental health counseling program in your area and it's not going to affect things. The other thing is, like, if you're going to be a clinician, clients don't give a shit. They don't care where you went to school. I've been practicing for almost 30 years. I would bet that I've never been asked by a client where I went to school, or I would bet I've never even been asked by a client what my degree is. They just know that I'm, somehow calling myself a professional therapist. They might not even know, does that mean I have a doctorate or a master's or a bachelor? They just don't know, and they don't care. So, I think you're in a mindset of academia and elitism that might actually derail you in your ability to choose the best program. What you need is a program that fits well with you. Like, let's say that one of the mid-tier counseling programs in your area is actually the one that you feel the most comfortable at. Well, I would tell you to go to the one that you feel the most comfortable at going on. But one professor who I have grown close to this semester has been adamantly trying to get me out of going to that top mental health counseling program as well, and encouraging me to go into social work instead. He has been very insistent on this. He keeps mentioning how social workers have a much better lobbying organization, how bad the lobbying organization is for counselors, how social workers have much better career opportunities, and how they get reimbursed significantly more and more often than counselors do for insurance, even in private practice. I keep telling him my end goal is to open a private practice, and I have little to no interest in casework and policy-related coursework, but he keeps doubling down and saying it won't matter after I graduate, and that I will learn to be a therapist on the job, and that the grad school curriculum doesn't matter. He did recommend Smith College to me because he knows I am interested in a program with a psychodynamic orientation, but they are the only psychodynamic social work program I have been able to find. So just chiming in there, yeah, it's hard to find programs that are actually oriented even towards any particular theory, let alone psychodynamic. Usually, master's programs are there to teach you a variety of the theories, if not all of the main umbrella theories. So there's that. But you'll find that programs will tend to focus on certain things, basically because you have professors that like a certain thing. Like people that went to my university and took a lot of classes with me were exposed to a lot of psychodynamic and attachment-oriented theory, and would have left the university with a lot of knowledge with that. But that was just because they took a lot of classes with me. If they didn't take any classes with me, then they might not have had any psychodynamic or any attachment-oriented talk. So it just kind of depends on the program. Some programs are more buttoned up about that. Like we need to make sure we really hammer this idea into people. Going out through email. After some Googling and internet research, I have found a lot of people who seem to agree with him. There are tons of threads where people are being talked out of attending counseling programs. I also read that some of the psychoanalytic institutes in New York City don't accept counselors into their programs. Is my professor right? Will a counseling degree really limit my work opportunities, ability to accept insurance, and ability to attend psychoanalytic institute in the future? End of email. Well, the problem here, Mark, is that, like I was saying earlier, there's a huge divide between the West Coast and the Northeast. So I don't really know. I know enough about the difference between the West Coast and the Northeast to know that the Northeast does have a long tradition of this bifurcation or something between psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and then everyone else. Whereas on the West Coast, social workers are the way that you are talking about them initially, where they're more, not only are they somewhat trained in being a therapist, but they're also trained on casework and policy-related coursework and other kinds of teamwork, like working in a hospital. And so if someone was in Seattle and they wanted to be in private practice, I would not recommend that they get a degree in social work. Now, could you, as your professor says, get a degree in social work and have it work out fine? Yeah, absolutely. I know many of licensed clinical social workers who are fantastic therapists. I've had one of my primary therapists that I've had over the years is a social worker. So like I was saying earlier, your graduate program doesn't have a lot to do with where you end up 5, 10, 20 years later into your career. So I guess I would listen to the people around you. There's a chance if you plan on staying in the Northeast, there's a chance that the advice that I give about that topic is not applicable to you. Having said that, there are people all over the world that will email in. If you're in Britain, if you're in Australia, if you're in Ireland, or if you're in Germany, there's a whole Japan, there's a whole different system in these other countries. And I guess one could say that there's a significantly different system between the West Coast and the Northeast. There's also a significantly different system between California and Washington and Oregon. California has this whole other system that is kind of odd and oriented towards marriage and family therapy. So anyway, but I would be skeptical about someone, I don't know. I don't live in your area. I don't know a lot of clinicians in your area, but I'm skeptical of the statement that if you get a counseling master's, that it would be significantly worse in the end. But I don't know. So maybe I would ask around for more opinions, maybe even ask for the reimbursement rates that the insurance will give for an usually it's like a 50-minute session, 55-minute session. Ask the local and a couple insurance companies, local like the Blue Cross Blue Shield, and ask them, what is your reimbursement rate for a 55-minute counseling session versus a 55-minute social work counseling session, and maybe get some data around that. I don't know, but so I don't know how helpful I am. It also depends on where you stand on where you plan on practicing, right? If you plan on practicing in the Northeast, then I would listen to professionals out there. But if you plan on practicing anywhere else in the United States, in my anecdotal, and I looked into this a lot as well in terms of research. My understanding, the last I looked at the data, was that counselors around the country are highly respected, as are marriage and family therapists, as are social workers. So this idea that you would be worse off by being a counselor just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But who knows? I don't know. I guess my answer is I don't know. All right, this next email is from anonymous middle tier patron. She says, have you ever been friends with someone who could be labeled as an abuser? I've been watching your videos on Ed and Liz about not getting triangulated, staying differentiated, and listening more instead of advising. So just chiming in here, if you don't watch these shows with me, there's a couple on 90 Day Fiancé, Ed and Liz. And from the way it looks like Ed is a emotional and verbal abuser of Liz, maybe even a gaslighter of Liz. It's not severe, but it's notable. And it appears that Ed gets threatened and insecure pretty easily with jealousy, and then he resorts to this calm attack that he will exhibit to Liz, and Liz has a lot of issues in her childhood that makes it harder for her to push back, but she does push back sometimes anyway. And so sometimes, I don't know exactly what the patron is talking about, but I was probably talking about how it's easy to be convinced by one side or the other, to get triangulated, to get pulled in, and that if you want to be helpful to the couple and yourself, then remaining differentiated is important. So going on, which I understand to be good advice to not get triangulated, but my friend is in a mutually toxic relationship, and I don't know what to do when my one friend asks directly for my advice. I don't know what to say. End of email. Okay, so you're saying that you have a friend who's in a mutually toxic relationship, and your friend is like, hey, what do I do? And you feel the compulsion to give advice, probably advice like, hey, you should probably break up, or you should draw boundaries or something. And your friend is saying, hey, I don't know what to do. Tell me what to do. One thing to think about is that when you actually look at the situation, sometimes your friend might actually not be directly asking for advice. They might just be venting, and it might feel like they're asking for advice, but they're not actually consciously asking for advice. But let's just assume that your friend is actually asking for advice. And now, providing advice doesn't mean that you're being dysfunctionally triangulated. The fact that you're listening to your friend means you're already being triangulated to some extent, right? It's just a matter of what you do with that triangulation. So, for example, if I had a friend that came to me and said, and it was just like years and years of this, they're just saying, I had another fight with my partner, and, we're fighting all the time, and he just never listens to me, and he stays out all night and drinks. I don't even know, he might be cheating on me or something, And I would feel bad for my friend. I'd feel hurt and angry for my friend. And I'd say like, you don't have to deal with this shit. You should be able to leave. And I would feel that urge to say that sort of thing. But I hope I would know that notion has occurred. I mean, that's the thing you always want to check in with yourself is ask yourself this question before you give advice. Is it probable that the person has already thought of this? Because if they've already thought of it, then why do you think they need to be told that sort of stuff, Of course, in my situation, the example that I'm giving, my friend knows that she can break up with her partner. She knows that. So why do I think it's important that I say that out loud? It doesn't make any sense, right? So, and there's a lot of different situations, but I would check in with myself and say, I have an urge to tell her to break up. I wish for her to break up, and that's my issue, not her issue. Okay, what do I do with that? Well, I have to put that aside for now, and then I would try to refocus on how can I be a good friend, okay? Not how can I fix the problem, but how can I be a good friend? And that's a very different point of view, hopefully. So if I'm going to be a good friend, well, a good friend doesn't offer stupid pieces of advice that are obvious. A good friend is there listening. A good friend provides empathy. So I might say something like, especially if my friend is literally asking me, please tell me what to do. What would you do? I would say something like, yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really difficult situation. I mean, obviously you can break up if you want to, but I think it's more complicated than that. But all I can say is I appreciate just how difficult the situation is. I'm guessing that you do have affection for your partner, and that's what keeps you in it. I'm guessing there are pros and cons. And it's a conundrum, How do you know when to leave? How do you know when to stay? And also, it sounds like he's really hurting you, and there's a lot of hurt maybe going both ways. It just makes me sad to hear that about your life. I'm sad for you. And, I'm with you, and I'm here for you in whatever way you want me to be here, things like that. I mean, it's kind of cheesy what I'm saying, but, along those lines, right? I'm being more tentative. I'm not giving advice. I'm speaking from the heart. I'm empathizing. I am reflecting back to them that I hear them, that I appreciate their, that's why people tend to go to therapists, because therapists are more likely to do this kind of thing, because friends are not very good at doing this kind of thing. Therapists are much better at being able to empathize and speak in a more tentative, humble, caring way, rather than just jumping to a piece of advice. You talk to someone else, say this woman is talking to her other friend. The other friend might just be like, you need to leave. What's wrong with you? You're in a toxic relationship. There can be some shaming involved. It's like, I can't believe you're constantly burdening me with this. Like, just shit or get off the pot kind of a thing. And that's why people go to therapists, because they hopefully are trained and know that that's not really what's going to help. It's not what the person wants. It's not really what's going to help them to move on to the next step. Sometimes what will prompt people to take action is if they are finally heard and understood by at least somebody. Sometimes you have to start from the ground level of just like, you are understood. I understand you. I see you. I recognize what's happening for you. I validate your feelings. And then once they have that under their belt, then the person can actually take action, maybe breaking up or maybe not, or asserting themselves or something. So that's how I do it. Your question, patron, you're like, have you ever been friends with someone who could be labeled as an abuser? Because, well, actually, that's a bit different of a question now that I'm looking at it. So if my friend was the abuser, because you said mutually toxic, but if my friend was the toxic person, okay, well, that's a little different, similar. But so if I had a friend that was giving me indications, well, I've been in these shoes. I've had friends who I have, at least in my head, labeled as being abusive to their partners. Not physically, but verbally abusive. And I, sort of dominant. And let's see, if they came to me, well, it depends on their relationship, but I can think of one relationship where I had a friend who I observed, a couple of decades ago to be abusive to his wife verbally. And the first couple times I saw it, I was like, what was that? Because it was different than his normal behavior. The way he treated his wife was very different than his other kinds of behavior. And I didn't really know what to do with it, but over time it happened repeatedly. And so I don't know exactly how it came up, but it just sort of randomly came up in conversation. And I said, well, I'll tell you, I think I don't think I used the word abuse, but I think I used the word sexist or overpowering or uncaring or something. I think I said something like, sometimes you can be pretty harsh with your wife. And I don't know what's going on there. It sounds like you're getting triggered at times, but you talk to her in a way that you don't talk to other people. And, I'm not his therapist, so we don't have that kind of venue to necessarily dive deep into that sort of thing. But that's what I would say. And I, at the time, and I think I correctly surmised that it wouldn't ruin our relationship. I could say that and not have him say, well, I hate you now, that kind of thing. So I was trying to help. I was trying to help him and her by telling him that he needs to look at the way that he treats her, So whether you're a friend or a therapist and someone is coming to you for help, the key is always to keep your eye on what do you think will help. Because I ran it, and any student of mine knows that the mantra I kept saying was, do what is helpful, do what is helpful. Because so much of learning how to be a therapist feels like you're learning rules, like, oh, you never do this and you always do this. And I would try to break that from my trainees by saying, there's no nevers and always in therapy. There's only that you need to try to be helpful. And, there'll be these things like you never cross your legs in therapy or never accept a gift in therapy. And what I'll say is that, well, in general, it probably isn't helpful to accept gifts from clients, but sometimes it might actually be helpful to accept a gift from a client. And so you need to do what is helpful. And in the moment, you probably are the only one who knows whether or not it's going to be helpful. And you can make justifications for it. When in doubt, take the easier, more safe route by not accepting the gift. But people will say like, well, is it okay if I do this? Or what if this happens? Or what am I supposed to do when this happens? And I always say, well, what do you think will help? What do you think will help? What do you think will help? Be helpful. So when your friend comes to you and they are determined by you to be abusive and they're asking for advice, do what is helpful. Don't do what you think is the right way to do it, because that can actually be unhelpful. These sort of rules like don't get triangulated are only there. They're not rules. They're just guidelines on how to be helpful to everyone, how to create the best outcome. Okay. So if your friend comes to you and it would be helpful to confront them, then confront them. If it won't be helpful to confront them, then don't confront them. If it's helpful to give them advice, like, hey, I think you're being abusive and I advise you not to do that, and you think that your friend will hear that somewhat, or it'll plant a seed or something, then maybe do that. But if you think he's not going to listen, or he's going to misinterpret you, or it's going to cause a whole other problem, like now there's a conflict between you and your friend, then that's not necessarily the best course of action. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. I feel like we were talking about a lot of random things in this episode. And hopefully by the next time I'm podcasting, I will be over this cold. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.